Okay, so let's begin with Chapter 8, Sexually Transmitted Infections. When I was a kid growing up, these kinds of infections were called VD, or venereal disease. Then they were called sexually transmitted diseases, or STDs. Now we've changed the name to sexually transmitted infections. Each of these steps in the changes in the nomenclature have been focused on trying to destigmatize these diseases because STIs are the only class of infection that are categorized by how you get them. And a lot of people think that's stigmatizing and reduces the likelihood that a person would get treatment or admit that they have the infection, and therefore would make it more likely that they transmit it to others and things like that. I have a tendency not to buy into superficial semantic changes as the key to making the thing okay. So you may hear me slipping and calling them STDs because it's been a long time I've been teaching this class, and so that was sort of like my classic way of referring to them. STIs came along probably about 10 years ago and really became the industry standard probably within that period of time. So I apologize in advance if I call it an STD. It's not an attempt to malign anyone or anything. There are three main categories of STIs. There are the viral STIs that are, as of right now, incurable. There are some medications that make them treatable, but so far we have not figured out a way to completely clear your body of a viral invader. Bacterial STIs are curable with antibiotics, but some of them are becoming less curable thanks to antibiotic resistance. So we'll talk about that. And then our final category would be parasitic, which would be things that live on or in us, that sometimes respond to antibiotics, sometimes they respond to topical treatment, sometimes they respond to antifungals. There's different things for the parasitic. So, but the idea with the parasitic is that they almost always are curable. Okay, so let's move into the viral category, and we'll start with herpes simplex virus 1. So I'm pushing buttons and nothing's happening, so sorry about that. Okay, so first off, herpes simplex virus 1, or HSV1, is the virus that most commonly is associated with cold sores. So you see this person has a blister on their lip, and we call them cold sores because a lot of times they emerge when you're sick. So like you've got a cold, and then on top of that you also get this cold sore. The reason why that happens is because the herpes virus, here the person has their cold sore basically emerges on the roof of their mouth. I don't know if their general dental hygiene is related to the fact that they have these outbursts, or if these outbursts are related to their dental hygiene, but here we have where it's spread to the person's eyes. This is a little kid, and a lot of times when you touch HSV1, the virus will shed, and then you can transfer that virus to other mucous membranes. Here we have a person who has it on his nose and on his face. So it's not just on your lips, it's not just even on your mouth, it could be in any of your facial mucous membranes. The reason why they tend to pop out when you're having a cold or some other infection is because when you're under stress, the virus will reassert itself. So this is probably the most common sexually transmitted infection because we can transmit this through kissing. But they think something more than 80% of the adult population probably has HSV1. They say by age 25, about 50% of Americans have antibodies to it, which implies that they've been exposed to it. And by age 50, about 90% of us do. So it's a really common, primarily sexually transmitted infection, but theoretically you could pick it up from sharing glasses, drinking out of the same glass, or through sharing other things that come in contact with wherever the location of the cold sore is, and then somebody else's mucous membrane. So it could be, your hands could transmit it, other things like that. Now, herpes simplex virus 2 is the virus that typically affects the genitals and lower mucous membranes. So here's the virus that causes HSV2. Usually when you get infected with this virus, about 2 weeks after exposure, you experience something that makes you think you've got the flu. So you get a fever, you have pain, how with the flu you get sort of achy all over. You feel like you've got the flu. And a lot of times, because it's been 2 weeks since you were exposed to the virus, people don't put it together that these flu-like symptoms are a result of having had unprotected sex with somebody who might have given them HSV. So about 7 to 10 days after these flu-like symptoms emerge, blisters will emerge. And here we have a penis with some blisters on it. And then those blisters pop and they cause open sores. The way that we transmit both kinds of HSV is through viral shedding. So what that means is that the virus gets into the outer layer of the skin, and then the virus can actually be shed from the person who already has its skin to the other person who's about to receive its skin. So it's viral shedding. The main treatment that we have available for HSV infection is different kinds of antiherpetics. If you've ever tried an over-the-counter cold sore remedy, those are trying to treat the swelling and stuff like that. These are oral medications that you can take that will help to reduce the viral load and make it less likely to have a cold sore outbreak. But we can't clear you of either kind of HSV. The way that they work, like I mentioned, is that when you're under stress, you may get an outburst. How does that happen? Well, during the latent period, so after you've had those initial blisters, the HSV, whether it's one or two, will retreat into your epithelial cells, those are your skin cells, and they'll go into your nerve cells where they'll be held by your sensory neurons in the nucleus. When you're under some kind of stress, it could be psychological stress, you've got a lot of deadlines at school or something like that, could be enough to trigger an outbreak. It could be physical stress like being pregnant or having been sick recently. It could be physical stress like being exposed to the sun and getting a sunburn. A lot of times people think that the sun is what causes their cold sores on their mouth, when in fact the sun did, in a way, it put the body under stress, and then that caused the virus to come back out of those nerve cells and emerge back into the epithelial cells. Typically, the virus will keep reemerging, cause the cold sore or the blisters in the same spot where it initially caused the blisters, but it's possible for the virus to reemerge in a new area of the same mucous membrane. So a person who's been having, let's say, a cold sore on the right side of their mouth may suddenly get one on the left side of their mouth. But usually it'll just keep recurring in the same spot. So here we have rates of infection with HSV, and we see in the top left panel non-Hispanic black males. In the bottom left panel we have non-Hispanic black females. We have in the top right non-Hispanic white males, and in the bottom right non-Hispanic white females. And then they're broken up by age group. If you average across all ages, would be the far left on the x-axis of each panel. And then we've got 14 to 19, 20 to 29, and so on. And then we have the year that they were tested. So this is what we call a cross-sectional study, where we're looking at different snapshots of age groups across time. And what you're seeing is for non-Hispanic white males, the rates of HSV infection among 14 and 19-year-olds has been going down over time. For 20 to 29-year-olds, going down over time. 30 to 39-year-olds going down. For the 40 to 49-year-olds, it stayed relatively stable, and the idea is that they probably got infected earlier. Same basic patterns happening for the white females, the non-Hispanic white females in the lower panel. You see that the 30 to 39-year-olds had a little spike in the 1999 to 2002 data collection, but otherwise the general pattern is lower rates of infection among the 14 to 19 up to the 30 to 39-year-olds. And we see a similar kind of pattern in the non-Hispanic black females. Again, with the 20 to 29-year-old non-Hispanic black females, we see a spike in the 1999 to 2002 data, but otherwise you see either stability or a drop over time. With the non-Hispanic black males, you don't see quite the same pattern. For the 14 to 19-year-olds, it's going down over time, but in the 20 to 29-year-olds, it's pretty stable, and it actually started to kind of tip back up in the 2007 to 2010 data. And then the 30 to 39-year-olds and the 40 to 49-year-olds, it's been pretty stable. So that kind of implies that among non-Hispanic black males, HSV is still, they're not doing what it takes to protect themselves from contracting that virus at the rate that these other three groups are doing. And that's a real question, like how to get people to do the behaviors that would reduce the likelihood of transmission. And that's the key with these viral infections, is reducing the rates of transmission. Because once you've become infected, all you're doing is beating back symptoms, and you're always going to have the virus, and you're always going to be able to pass that virus on to someone else. So it's really important to reduce the likelihood of transmission. All right. So I wanted to say one more thing about herpes. So with regard to genital herpes, condoms help to reduce the probability of transmission. But if you've got a herpes sore or a location where the virus might be shed, that's outside of where normally the condom would protect. So something outside of directly the vagina or directly the penis, if it's on your scrotum, it's on your labia majora, it's anywhere around the genitals, but not the direct thing that would be protected by a condom, HSV is not very well protected against that, right? Because you've got skin-to-skin contact and that viral shedding. So because this virus isn't carried in the semen or in the vaginal secretions, that's why HSV is not one of those infections that they say, well, if you just use condoms, you'll be protected. You've got to make sure that you don't have skin-to-skin contact with an area where a person has had outbreaks. All right, we have hepatitis B. Hepatitis B was only identified maybe 30 years ago, and it took a while to figure out how it's transmitted. We now know that it's transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids. And in this graphic, we can see that the biggest part of this pie chart is injecting drug use. People who share needles can share this virus. And then we have the next biggest section, which is 15% of transmission is thought to be due to sexual transmission. And then we have all these other causes that can, occupational oftentimes is needle sticks for nurses who are treating people who have hepatitis B, people who have received transfusions, and then we have a 12% who there's no way to figure out how they got it. So sexual transmission isn't the most common, but it definitely is something that we would want to protect against. And why do we want to protect against it? Well, look at the symptoms. This is not a colorized picture. This is what this person actually looks like because they're showing symptoms of jaundice. Jaundice is the yellowing of the skin and the yellowing of the whites around the eyes. So jaundice usually appears when you start to develop cirrhosis of the liver. You might have heard of cirrhosis of the liver and thought that it was something that you just get when you are an alcoholic, but anytime that you're starting to build like hard places in your liver, that's what's called cirrhosis. And so the liver isn't filtering things correctly anymore, and you'll start to get a buildup of what's called bilirubin, and that's what causes the jaundice. So this is a symptom that your liver has really pretty much stopped filtering stuff. So how do we prevent it? Well, we have a vaccine now, hepatitis B vaccine, that probably a lot of you have received already, because as of, at least I know of, in 2000 by 2000, I think, they were requiring children to have the vaccine before they could enter school. So probably a lot of you guys have already had this vaccine. It's a series of 3 that you would take. If you haven't had the vaccine, it's not too late if you haven't been infected, and it can protect you from transmission. If a person has it, first off, they can't drink alcohol anymore because the liver's already working, is already at a deficit, and alcohol makes it work too hard. There are medications like interferon, and they're working on other medications. There's a medication on the market right now, but it costs something like $100,000 for the full course of treatment to they think clear the hepatitis from your system. They're not exactly sure if it's a permanent removal or if it's just a really significant beatback, and possibly a liver transplant. But you're lower on the transplant list if you have hepatitis B, because the new liver would be ultimately damaged by the virus also. So these are the treatments we have available. So these are not very good options, right? So a person wants to, again, focus on not getting it. Now, hepatitis B is carried in bodily fluids. So this is one of those STIs that works, the condoms work really well in preventing transmission. So condom use, number 1. And then, of course, do not share intravenous syringes. You just do not want to share those because that's the best way to contract hepatitis B. Here we have incidence of acute hepatitis B by sex, and you can see that males are more likely to have hepatitis B than females are on average across time when they started counting in 2000. This is hepatitis B infection by race and ethnicity. And you see American Indian Alaskan Native had a spike there in the 2002 data. Something weird was going on in 2002, wasn't it? Because we saw those weird spikes in the HSV data also. So I'm not exactly sure if I'm trusting that spike. But what you see is that the highest rates of infection seem to be among the Black non-Hispanics and American Indians. Now keep in mind this is per 100,000 population, so even though there are relatively few American Indians compared to other racial groups, they are overrepresented in infections. And why? Probably IV drug use is the best explanation for the Black non-Hispanic and for the American Indian Alaskan Native high rates. And then you'll notice that the Asian Pacific Islander had been higher in the early part of the century, but now it's coming down even with the white and Hispanic rates, which are relatively low. So non-IV drug use is the #1 way to prevent, and then using condoms. And then we have acute hepatitis B reports by risk exposure / behavior. So we're looking at the rates of people having hepatitis B based on different behaviors that they engage in. And so you see household contact is at the bottom. So I have somebody living in my household who has hepatitis B, and now I have it. So is it possible that you got it through contact with them? And so what you see is mostly that's going to be no, or that this is missing data. Multiple sex partners is the next one up, and you see that no is more common than yes, and then the data being missing is more common than all of them. Let's ignore the missing data for the rest of them. So men who have sex with men, mostly no, so it's probably not more likely to occur if you are having sex with other men, if you're male. And then through sexual contact, it's much lower than injection drug user. So the best way to prevent this is not to share needles, and then use a condom when you have sex. Okay, how about HPV, or human papillomavirus? A lot of times we call these genital warts, which is kind of a little bit of a misnomer because you can get these warts in other parts of your body. The main symptoms are you get warts, and not like individual warts, but like clusters of them. So we've got a penis that has warts, we have a vagina that has warts. You see it actually in the introitus, the area that is actually for penetration. You can see a wart there. You can see them along the labia minora, the labia majora. You can see them all over. You can get it around your rectum. You can get them in your mouth. So any mucous membrane can harbor genital warts. So that's why we call it HPV now. So how do we get HPV? Well, it's going to be the same like what we said with herpes. It's through viral shedding. So coming in contact with these warts or the place where the warts grow, you could pick up the virus and it can invade your epithelial cells. So if you have a penis that comes in contact with an anus, if one of those two already has HPV, the other one can pick it up also. So you can get it through oral sex, you can get it through any kind of contact. So we now have a vaccine for it, and some of you may have had it. It's still optional. They recommend, they started with girls, saying girls starting at age 12 should get the HPV shot, and then they recognized that males get it and that the shot worked for preventing their contraction of it also. And so now they recommend for both sexes that they should get vaccinated. But I think you can only get vaccinated up to the age of 29. So it's something that you do when you're younger, and then you reach a certain age and it's too late to get the vaccine. Once you're infected, really the only treatment is to try and remove these warts as they appear. So like for example, you can imagine that the woman on the top right probably has some pain associated with those warts being where they are. And so, and around the rectum, I can imagine that that's uncomfortable. And so they can remove these, but they probably will regrow. Some people have really strong immune systems that can fight these warts off, and some people have really weak immune systems and they grow completely unchecked. If you've ever seen the tree man of Borneo, there was a documentary about him on TLC. And if you haven't seen it, just Google images for Tree Man of Borneo, and he is a man who has not genital form, but regular human papillomavirus, and hasn't got the ability to fight it off at all. Like his immune system doesn't recognize it as an invader at all, and so he just has these warts that have taken over his hands and his legs, and they're all over his body. And he does look like he's covered in bark, but it's all HPV. And ultimately, at the end of the documentary, they removed most of it, but it's going to grow back. So a lot of people who get exposed to this virus may not actually have the kind of extensive response that you're seeing here in these pictures. One thing that made the vaccine really important for both males and females is that it's been shown that certain strains of HPV have been linked to the development of cervical cancer. And so if we can prevent a person from contracting HPV, then we reduce that woman's risk of contracting, later on developing cervical cancer. So here we have the rates in thousands. This comes from the Centers for Disease Control as of 2013. And what you can see is that over time, the rates of HPV have been going up. You can see that there were lower rates during the 90s than there are right now. Like there had been a drop relative to the 80s at that time. You got to remember, around the 90s is when people decided they weren't going to be having sex anymore, or they were really going to significantly reduce the number of partners that they had. And people all of a sudden realized condoms could be really helpful. They're not just for sailors anymore and stuff like that. That's an old reference from Austin Powers, right? Oh, rubbers are for sailors, baby. In the 90s, people started to realize the value of condoms, but then people have gotten a little bit more lackadaisical in modern times and have started having unprotected sex again, and thinking that they're not at very high risk for contracting STIs. And so what we're seeing is some of these on the rise again, like HPV. So vaccine / now, of course, a condom will help protect you from HPV if the virus is on the specific genitals. But if the virus is on, again, the scrotum or the labia majora or the rectum or something like that, you can still contract it even if you've got a condom on or your partner's wearing a condom. So it's not, condoms aren't a guaranteed protection. Now you'll notice that Gardasil was approved in 41 states. I showed you at what year, 2008. And you don't necessarily see a drop in the rates. So it's not like Gardasil seems to be completely protecting people from contracting it. Maybe we need a little bit more time. If we started vaccinating 12-year-olds in 2008, maybe we need a little bit more time for those recipients to age into the period where they might be protected, and maybe we'll see numbers starting to go down again. All right, I'm going to stop here because HIV is going to take me a little bit of time, so I'll stop here and we'll come back in the next section.